Hello Year 13. We've come to an exciting point in our study of the course because I'm actually not going to deliver any new content now. We've read the texts and we have looked at them in detail. So now we come to a point where we're going to start our revision. So I'm going to spend the rest of this half term, possibly a little bit into next half term, revising Top Girls and Feminine Gospels, and then the rest of the time will be spent revising the Awakening and your Unseen sections. So in this particular session, I want to focus on context and then an introduction of Act 1. What I'm going to start asking you to do is to reread the text. Now that you have lots of knowledge about the text and now that you've read the poems that you're comparing it to, it's a good point to start rereading the text, and I'm going to set a section of text to read during each lesson with that new knowledge so that you can start to think about how you can use ideas from the text. So today's lesson is going to focus around revising the context of the text because it's something that's so important to be able to link to the text in your exam responses. We'll start with looking at the writer's life, the social and political contexts of the text, cultural context and historical context, and at that point we'll start to introduce Act 1. Okay, so we'll begin with the writer's life. Carol Churchill was once hailed as one of Britain's greatest poets and innovators for the contemporary stage. And she's best known throughout her plays for her exploration of feminism and her use of non-naturalistic methods. So I'm going to give you some information about Churchill's own life, and then you're going to consider how it shaped the text. So you might want to pause the video at this point and draw yourself a table as I have shown on the screen with 2 columns to help you to explore the context of Churchill's own life and how that helped to shape the text. Okay, so Churchill was born to 2 parents. Her mother was a fashion model and her father was a political cartoonist. How might that have shaped the way that Top Girls is written? Have a think about Churchill's own politics and how that comes through in the text. In addition to this, she held strong socialist views. Can you spot any evidence of her socialist views in the play? Write them down there. Can you find any evidence of her anti-capitalist views also? And then finally, she wrote her plays whilst raising a family. So she had children, but her most successful, her most celebrated plays were written while she was raising her children. So how might that have shaped ideas about motherhood within the play? So copy and complete the table with your ideas about how the context shapes the play, because it's not enough just to know facts about her life and times. We have to be able to understand how that has in some way influenced and shaped the text. Off you go. Okay, so moving forwards then, social and political context. This play was written in 1982, and in 1982, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. Now this was a huge moment in history because she was the first female Prime Minister. Before that, all of the Prime Ministers had been male, reflecting the patriarchal structure of society, that leaders should be male, and she challenged those notions. She was Prime Minister from 1979 to 1990, so she was Prime Minister when this play was written and performed. And as I said, her election as Prime Minister was a huge moment for feminism. Finally, women were getting recognised as being worthy of being in power. But we can infer from what we know about Churchill already that she wasn't the biggest supporter of Thatcher. She might herself have been excited by the first female Prime Minister, but Thatcher was a capitalist. She held really strong, controversial anti-socialist views. And she was often called the Iron Lady, which carries connotations of being quite unfeeling and unmoving. Now, Churchill herself said that she wrote Top Girls in response to this moment in history, in response to the first female Prime Minister and Margaret Thatcher. She also noted that she based her protagonist, Marlene, on Thatcher. So pause the video now and I want you to write down similarities between Marlene and Margaret Thatcher. Off you go. Okay, to help us to truly understand what kind of a person Margaret Thatcher was and how Churchill might have reacted to Margaret Thatcher, I have some quotations on the screen that I think will demonstrate why Churchill was so anti-Thatcher, being that she held those socialist views. So Thatcher said very famously, "The problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money." Now, we know that Churchill was a socialist, so she would have been probably angered by what Margaret Thatcher said there. Also, one of the things, although Churchill didn't want to be labelled as a feminist, she undoubtedly explores issues of feminism within her play. And Margaret Thatcher said, "The feminists hate me, don't they? And I don't blame them, for I hate feminism. It is poison." Okay. Again as well, we can see in that third quotation in the bottom left hand of the screen where Marlene's attitude towards life seems to mirror that of Thatcher's. Thatcher said, "I don't know anyone who has got to the top without hard work. That is the recipe. It will not always get you to the top, but should get you pretty near." At this point as well, it's probably a good thing to think back on your learning that you did when we studied Blood Brothers at GCSE and how Willie Russell, as a socialist writer himself alongside Caryl Churchill, demonstrated to us through his characterisation of Mickey that even if you work really hard, a capitalist structure of society seems to entrap the working class. Okay, so moving forward then, so that's Margaret Thatcher, but alongside Margaret Thatcher there was other political legislation that was brought into place that led to a social movement. So examining the social context then, we want to look at this idea of the new woman. This term, the new woman, was coined by Sarah Grand and made popular by Henry James, a writer. So in the 20th century, throughout that time, there was a rise in legislation affecting women and their ability to work. And that was as follows. Now, you might want to write these down so that you can try to remember them as you write your exam responses, because they are important. So the Abortion Act happened in 1967. In 1969, there was the Divorce Reform Act. So prior to 1969, only men could seek to divorce women. The Equal Pay Act occurred in 1970. In 1974, contraceptives became available on the NHS. And in 1975, the Sex Discrimination Act was passed. I want you to think about how these things might have impacted on a woman's ability to work. So traditionally, prior to this point, a woman might take up a job, but once she became a mother, she would be expected to stay at home and her role would become more domestic. If you think of the stereotype of the 50s housewife, particularly one that we've seen exemplified in Roald Dahl's short story with the lamb to the slaughter, where she hits her husband over the head with a lamb. So these new pieces of legislation actually led to women being able to move from the domestic sphere into the work sphere because they gave women greater choice over family planning, whether they wanted to become a mother or not, and also protected women in the workplace with things like the Equal Pay Act. Because prior to this, it was perfectly legal to pay a man more than a woman simply because he was a man. And so this legislation, coupled with other movements in feminism, which I'll explore in the next slide, led to the birth of the new woman. The new woman was a woman who could go out into the workplace, that wasn't confined to the domestic sphere, that wasn't defined even by her marriage to a man. This was a woman who could be more independent financially, and as I said, could enter the workplace and reject being a mother, etc. Okay, in addition to all of those things then, There were also seminal feminist writing, so we had a new wave of feminism occurring. There was a woman's page for the first time in The Guardian, remembering that back in the day, before feminism, this new wave of feminism took off, things like newspapers and world affairs and things would be seen traditionally as something that would be consumed by a man. Those things even now were starting to recognise the new woman, and a woman's page was established in The Guardian in 1973. The women's liberation movement was formally active throughout the 1970s, and feminism was no longer concerned with reaching equality with men, but instead was focused around self-determination. So if we think about the earlier waves of feminism, things like the suffragette movement, that was focused around getting the same rights as men. This new wave of feminism was about individuality and being able to even take on positions of responsibility above men in workplaces and things like that. And so Churchill was writing at a very exciting point in history, because this was a point where women were starting to gain new responsibility, new freedom to be an individual and things like that. And so that undoubtedly shaped the text, because the text itself focuses around Marlene, an individual who is focused on achieving great success over men in the workplace. And we see that specifically through Marlene's promotion over Howard. And his reaction to that mirrors the old-fashioned views that men should be in power and women should be subordinate. Okay, so in addition to the social context and the political context, there's also the cultural context that we need to consider. So Top Girls is a work of postmodern theatre. And in the next slide, I'm going to talk you through the key features, if you like, of postmodern theatre. And what I want you to do is consider how those manifest in the play itself. So postmodernism was a literary and an artistic and cultural movement. It was a movement away from modernism, which was concerned with finding something new and unique. And here are some of the key features of postmodern theatre. So I'm going to read them out to you, and then I want you to think about if you can evidence that particular feature in Top Girls. So number 1, the accepted norms of seeing and representing the world are challenged. Experimental theatrical representations are created. Okay, so write that one down, and then next to it you can write down how we see that in Top Girls. So for me, the accepted norms of seeing and representing the world are challenged. We see how we only see the surface of a character through the character of Marlene, and how her own sacrifice and suffering and her own background and history and identity aren't revealed until the end of the play. So through that, Churchill asks us to question the accepted norms of society. Are we seeing people's true self? And I think she raises that question and answers it. I think, no, we're not seeing people's true self as we see through the character of Marlene. Also, in postmodern theatre, you'd see a pastiche of different textualities and media forms. So that means it would be created with reference to art, literature, etc. And absolutely, we can see that Churchill herself offers a pastiche of different textualities through Act 1. So write number 2 down for me, the pastiche of different textualities. And next to it, write down how that features in Top Girls. And the way it features is that Churchill uses characters from art through Dolgret, through literature from Patient Griselda, through legend or history. So characters like Pope Joan, people question whether she was real or not, or just a piece of legend. And she definitely offers that pastiche of different textualities. Okay, the next one then, often incomplete or broken narratives. Write that down. And next to it, try and think about how that particular method is employed in Top Girls. So for me, I think that Marlene's narrative is broken through the non-chronological order structure. Sorry. So we see her as a successful businesswoman, and only at the end do we see like the hidden sadness behind that. In terms of incomplete narratives as well, I don't know about you, but when I first read the play, I thought that those characters at the dinner party were going to be built upon in other scenes, but they're kind of just left there in Act 1. And I feel like their narratives are in some way incomplete, especially as they all talk over each other. Okay. Movement away from linearity to multiplicity. That sounds complex, but linearity means a story starts in one place and follows a kind of straight line, if you like, where one character is developed all the way through and ends nicely at the end. Multiplicity means lots of different narratives going on, and I absolutely think that's true of Top Girls, because you have the multiplicity in Act 1 where you're introduced to all of these different characters and they all start to offer their own narrative of their life. In Act 2, then you're introduced to the women who work in the Top Girls employment agency. So it further expands into multiplicity by introducing those new characters. Then you have the narrative of Joyce and Angie as well. So I don't think there's a linear structure to Top Girls. We're constantly introduced to new characters that show us something about society. Okay, the next one, characters are fragmented, forming a collection of contrasting and parallel shards. So again, that's absolutely true of lots of the characters that we encounter in Top Girls, particularly if we look at Marlene. Fragmented means broken into lots of different sections. And that's very true because we see a very different side of Marlene when she works at the Top Girls employment agency and puts on the mask of someone who is very successful, very career driven. But then we see the fragment, if you like, of her at home with Joyce, revisiting her past, and see the sadness and the working class background that she has come from. Okay, the next one then, each new performance contains something new. Now we have ourselves encountered this because Churchill revisited the play and decided to change the order of the scenes somewhat. So when we were in class, we noticed that if you had bought a different copy of the text, you had a different structure, a different order of scenes. And so absolutely Churchill kept revisiting that and kept adding something new to her play. And the play absolutely steps back from reality because we know the non-naturalistic methods employed by Churchill, where she uses women throughout history who could never, in reality, have come together at one dinner party. But equally, I think that really adds a lot to the play. The play steps back from reality, but in a way, I think that's one of its big successes because we're able to see the universality of the female experience. Okay, so in addition to that, I would absolutely add the bit about non-naturalistic methods as well as a final bullet point there, because I think that's probably one of the most important ones and the most frequently written about in your exams. Which leads us on to examine historical context. So Churchill explores the relationship between the past and the present in Act 1 of the play, where she brings together all of the women throughout history. And literature and art, etc. She conveys the universal female experience by bringing together these women from different points in history. We have Isabella Bird, who is the most modern of all of the historical women. She was alive from 1831 to 1904. Lady Nijo, Dolgret, who was a subject of a painting, Pope Joan, 854 to 856, and then Patient Griselda, who featured in the Canterbury Tales, which was written by Chaucer and is one of the oldest surviving works of literature. So clearly that's a non-naturalistic method because those characters wouldn't have been able to come together at a dinner party with Marlene in real life. Have a think about what you can remember about each character. What were they famed for? What was their success? Why do you think they might have been included? Okay, so I'll talk you through just very briefly, just in case there's any you can't remember, each of these characters so that you can start to think about the historical. So Isabella Bird was a famous female explorer and traveller. Now, women traditionally wouldn't have been able to go out and see the world at this time, but she defied those expectations and she did. She took a long time to marry, and in Victorian times that would be seen as quite scandalous. Being a spinster, an unmarried person, would be quite controversial at the time. We also might remember about Isabella Bird that she dressed intentionally in a feminine way to assert her femininity while she achieved her success. But lots of people questioned her femininity, particularly because of the way she rode a horse. But we know as logical present time readers, contemporary readers now, that actually that was because of her bad spine. But society wouldn't take into account things like that at the time. Lady Nijo then, she was a concubine to the emperor. She was born just for the to appease the sexual whims of the emperor, if you like. But she escaped and became a Buddhist nun. Delgret was the subject of the painting, and in the particular painting there were lots of women going into hell to retrieve their sons. Pope Joan was a woman that disguised herself as a boy so that she could study. Eventually she became the Pope, but struck up an affair and became pregnant and gave birth in the street before she was eventually killed just for being a woman. And then Patient Griselda, she was the character from the Canterbury Tales, and she had the really sad story of being married to a person who made her promise to do whatever he said. He took away her children, sent her home, and eventually she passed the test. She was obedient to him at all times, so he brought her back. Okay, so in terms of what I would like you to take away and do for this lesson, so I would like all of you to reread Act 1. That shouldn't take too long, but I want you to reread Act 1 having all of the new knowledge that you have now in terms of the sorts of things you might want to write about when comparing it to poetry. And I want you to look at it and think about which quotations will be particularly important. I want you to find evidence that each character has suffered, evidence of each character's achievement in Act 1. Find the "there was nothing in my life" quotations, because I think they're really important. And then finally, I'd like you to prepare for the next lesson by writing a summary of Act 1. Okay, so those are the things I'd like you to do independently before our next lesson.